Here.
Christine Hoffman.
Here.
Brenda Maresma.
Here.
Eddie Guevara.
Here.
David Cohill.
Here.
Marvin Dupree.
Here.
Rudy Dean.
Here.
John Costello.
Here.
Jason Sharp. Gaylord Cameron. Ed Dawson.
Here.
John McDaniel. Lance Huish.
Here.
Debbie White.
Here.
Okay, we're gonna move down to giving the floor to any visitors, if you want to. Okay. All right, and then we're gonna approve minutes. We're gonna start with general employees and police officer board approval of the minutes for May 9th, 2023. We just need a voice vote, so a motion and a second.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? And then the firefighters board to approve the minutes special quarterly pension board meeting held on May 16th, 2023. Motion?
So moved.
Second. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Moving on to AMCO's report.
Good afternoon. For anyone that doesn't know, our colleague Dan Johnson here with me today. He actually worked with the plan for many, many years. Is just visiting, or he'll probably chime in here or there, but isn't planning to present. Is that right?
That's right.
That's what he said.
That's what he said.
Let's see.
You've got the gavel, so. Well, good afternoon. Let's go ahead and jump right into the report. There's actually quite a bit of good news to all right. Thank you. All right, so I'll start on page number 4 of the report. You do have a hard copy in front of you if you'd like to follow along that way, especially for the police board if you don't want to have to turn around. But in the upper right-hand corner of page number 4, just an overview of the markets. The dark blue bar represents the S&P 500. It's up 8.7% in the quarter. Really a continuation of what we've seen the previous few quarters, even though the Fed has continued to raise interest rates, and that to varying degrees of impacting the bond market. The stock market has kind of continued to recover, in part optimism that interest rate increase cycle will be subsiding here soon. There's some debate about if there are any more raises to come yet in September or beyond, but there's the expectation that certainly that is slowing down. We've started to see inflation really coming back down from those elevated levels of 7 and 8%, significantly lower than that. So again, just general optimism that things are a little bit better in that environment. Within the equity market, though, you'll notice the difference between large cap and S&P 500 up over 8%. Small and mid cap was roughly half of that, 4 and change or 5 and change. So we did see large cap outperforming small cap. And then lastly, down at the bottom in green, we have fixed income. Negative numbers for the quarter, down roughly 1%. Last quarter, we did have a nice positive return as interest rates were somewhat stable to even falling just a little bit. But we did kind of retreat back. Interest rates moved back higher again this quarter, and so we're seeing those negative overall performance numbers for the 3 months. The bottom right-hand corner represents the last 12 months. And if you look closely, the graphs look very similar quarter over year in terms of their scale. Of course, the difference being that the last 12 months for the S&P up almost 20%. So the numbers obviously much better, but just interesting how the scale in terms of the outperformance is very similar. The international benchmark was a little bit lower. The ACWI ex-US was up about 12.7%, again underperforming the large cap S&P and also the small and mid cap of the domestic market. Fixed income, again, also negative over that 12-month period. As we look at the next page, again, we've talked about this quite a bit over the last 2 or 3 years, the difference between growth and value. So I'm on the top of page number 5 now. So the difference between the value stocks in blue and the green stocks, which represent growth, was almost 3 to 1 within the current quarter. As you recall, last year, as interest rates were really moving up quickly, growth was underperforming value, or value did better. in that rising interest rate environment. Even though interest rates have still been moving up, I think the optimism in part of that slowing down has really helped growth. Additionally, there's been a little bit of a nuance within the market, not only in the S&P 500, but specifically the large cap growth benchmark, which I actually have a page to kind of highlight for you a little bit later in the book, where the largest names within the index, really the top 7, have performed incredibly well, in particular the last 6 months, and that has been driving the vast majority of that performance, in particular on the growth side. I'm going to skip the next 6-7 pages and take you to page number 11. We've talked about interest rates. This has been an ongoing discussion, here for the last really 18 months as we, rebalanced out of equity and we're deciding whether we wanted to put in fixed income with rising interest rates. So again, just to kind of paint the picture of where we've been the last really 9 months, the Treasury yield curve in the bottom right-hand corner, the yellow line represents the most recent quarter end, June 30th. The green line is where we were 3 months ago. And what you can see across the board, the yellow line is higher than the green line. So again, that's the general rise in interest rates. As a reminder, bond prices move opposite of interest rates. So as interest rates move up, bond prices move down. And that's why we're seeing those negative results for the quarter. The other thing we've been talking about is the slope of this line. So the phrase that's used a lot in the press is inversion. And that's what we're talking about is the difference between the 2-year yield and the 10-year yield. And you can see the 2-year is just, at least as of June 30th, is just slightly under 5%, where the 10-year is slightly under 4%. And so typically, why would you be willing to take 100 basis points less in return to invest for 8 years longer? That doesn't really make sense, but that's the short version of my description of this graph is this is the way the bond market feels about the future. It's pointed down because it's expecting the future to be worse than today, i.e. recession. This is the bond market kind of demonstrating that they're expecting a recession to happen. We talked about this in the past. Every recession has been led by an inversion going back to 1925, 1930. With the caveat that not every inversion has been followed by a recession. So a lot of folks, they see inversion, they say, well, that means a recession is happening. Maybe it's more likely than not, but there have been inversions that have not been followed by a recession. So only time will tell as you continue to kind of watch the data. But again, just in case you're reading about that or hearing about that in the press, that's the inversion that's being discussed. Any questions on anything that I've covered kind of in the macro or market environment?
So the inversion, top green line, when it crossed, no, top.
Oh, up here.
Yes, and I could be wrong, but the green line passing the Fed funds rate, is that back in November 22? Is that the inversion?
The typical inversion that is discussed is the relationship between the 2-year and the 10-year, not the Fed funds. So that's why when you're looking at the actual graph itself, what you're looking at is this number here.
Is it yellow the 2-year?
The yellow 2-year versus the yellow 10-year. Now we've been inverted for the last 2 quarters. So it's not a new inversion, but it is a little steeper this quarter as compared to last quarter.
The 10-year is the green?
No, the green, it's still yellow. It's just over here, kind of 2/3. You see that?
That's the yellow, right? Where's the other yellow?
I see the yellow starting
The
from
lines
the top.
aren't yellow. That's not the years, Scott. Those are the dates. These are the years here. So 10 years here.
Okay.
So that negative slope is that inversion.
Okay.
But interesting, if you're looking at the negative slope, because short-term rates are even higher, there's even kind of a greater inversion from the shortest part of the curve down to the 10-year. But because there's so much fluctuation in that, or can be so much fluctuation in short rates, that's not the relationship that's looked at. It's the 2 to 10, the spread between them.
Gotcha.
For that traditional definition of inversion. All Now let's take you to page 14 and start to actually look at your specific plan assets. So as of the end of the quarter, we are at $109.3 million, and kind of a continuation of the rebound that we saw in the previous quarter, again, bouncing back up off that theoretical line, which represents the assumed rate of return. And then obviously, we've talked about this in the past as well, those blue bars or gray bars down at the bottom represent the net cash flow. And so you can see back in 2007, 2008 period, we turned negative, meaning you're negative in cash flow and you pay out more in benefits than you're bringing in contributions. But you've been able to continue to grow the assets. And that's really kind of the sweet spot of a long-term defined benefit plan, where even though you're paying out more in benefits than you're bringing in terms of contributions, yet you're still able to grow your assets at a faster rate than that negative cash flow. And again, that negative cash flow works out to be about $36.5 million more than you had put in, even though you've been able to grow again up close to $110 million in total assets. You can see the breakdown among managers on the next couple of pages. I like page number 17 because it shows the deviation from our targets and also our investment policy. It's been fairly consistent, where we are overweight to domestic equity by just under 4%, 3.8 as of the most recent quarter, just slightly over in international, and then underweight to fixed income. Mostly that's due to performance, but part of that has been to our decisions where even though we've been overweight, we've either kind of held some of that overweight because we didn't want to move it into fixed income with rising interest rates, and also kind of keeping some of that in cash as well. Again, what I will say is that the underweight to fixed income is slightly overstated because of that cash position. So if you added that cash up into the fixed income bucket, we'd only be under by about 3%. So again, within the normal ranges of the policy, but getting, especially on the equity side, getting near the top. Again, collectively, we can be 5% overweight to equity before we reach the maximum that's allowed in the ordinance and the policy. We're currently sitting at 4.1% over that as we sit today. We can come back to that discussion. I'm going to jump ahead to page 21 and talk about the actual results. So a lot of good news. We talked about the markets generally being positive. So your portfolio was nicely positive for the quarter. We were up 3.32% gross, 3.27% net, but we were behind the policy of 3.91%. Mostly due to relative performance, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But the most important number on the page, that second column in fiscal year to date, 13.5%. Again, behind the policy of 15.2, but relative to the assumed rate of return, a very strong rate of return, especially when you consider where we were last year, negative double digits, certainly seeing a very, very nice recovery. Just to kind of give you a little bit of an update, the plan assets as of this morning were up about $400,000, so just fractionally, but that works out to be a few basis points, so that 13.5, roughly speaking, is probably up to about 13.7, 13.8% or so on an updated basis. Longer term, again, still very strong. 5 years, slightly behind the benchmark at 6.7%, but placing in the 42nd percentile, outperforming 58% of the public funds around the country, and on the 10-year, 7.5%, and then the 43rd percentile. As we move down the page, you can see the individual components. Vanguard, we've got the index fund. It did exactly what it's supposed to, right in line, 8.4 for the quarter. Then we've got Allspring, our large cap growth manager. The best return within the quarter, 10.7%, but that was behind the benchmark of 12.8. And for the fiscal year, 24, almost 25% versus almost 32% for the benchmark. So a fairly sizable deficit within that large cap growth space. I think we've talked about this in the past, and I'll say it again. This has been kind of a common theme among growth managers. And again, a little bit later, I've got I guess if we're looking at it in paper, if you want to jump ahead to page 57, I included a little thing that you guys put together, didn't you? The Magnificent Seven?
I work with the chart.
There you go. Just to give you a little bit more perspective on what's been happening this chart specifically looks at the S&P 500 for the last 12 months on the top of the page, and then for the first 6 months of 2023 in the bottom left-hand corner, and that's really what I'll focus on. So in the last 6 months, from January 1st, the 7 largest names in the S&P 500, which also happen to be the 7 largest names in the Russell 1000 growth, and they're even a larger weighting within growth, are collectively up about 52.3%, versus the S&P in aggregate was up 17%, 16.9. And if you pulled out, those 7 from the S&P 500, so you just did the 493 stocks minus those 7 biggest, the S&P return would have dropped from almost 17% to 5.8%. So just to give you an indication as to how important that performance has been of those biggest names, of those top 7 names. So then when you take it back to the Allsprings of the world, if you didn't own Apple, Amazon, Microsoft at a market weight, you underperformed. Because essentially every other stock didn't do as well as the handful of names. So certainly that is disappointing. I mean, obviously you never want to underperform that way, but I would also make the argument that there's a pretty significant risk being that heavily weighted into such a small number of names. You saw that, if you look at the upper part of this graph, you can see what that looked like in the last 6 months of last year, where those same 7 names were down almost 20%. So certainly it is possible for that to go back the other way. It certainly has resumed in a positive direction in the last 6 months, but there's a lot of risk associated with that concentration. But that is a big reason why we're seeing some of that underperformance in large cap core or specifically large cap growth. Let me pause there and see if anybody has any question on that.
Next, back to page 14.
Sure.
What is the difference between, so we're talking about what was going out, cash flow going out versus our rate of return, so that's 7.5%. That's not the difference between the two. Do you know what that percentage is? Of what we're gaining versus what we're paying out?
Oh, in percentages?
Yeah, or whatever value you want to.
No, you mean, you're talking about there's the negative cash flow, the negative 36.5 million versus the 110? Is that?
Yes.
Or do you mean just the value between the 7.5 theoretical and the current?
Yeah, either way.
Well, so that red line shows the theoretical, the 7.5% rate of return. Now that is weighted. It wasn't always 7.5. It was higher before.
Okay.
But that if the plan was invested with the same cash flows, going all the way back to 1987, at that $11.8 million, it would be $101 million. Just earning the assumed rate of return. But your actual net number is at 109.3 million.
Right, and we got 36.5 basically going out.
That's the collective net cash flow.
Okay.
Correct. So in other words, if you go back to 87, you had 11.8 million. You paid out $36.5 million and still grew it to almost 110.
Okay.
Or paid out 3 times what you started with and still have 110 left over.
Yeah, I guess that my concern is, as that we pay more and more out, as more people retire, are we going to stay consistent in our gains, I guess?
That would be factored in with the actuarials. So, if there was a significant change in the profile of the number of retirees, the payments, and the assets were not growing enough to sustain that cash flow, then that's where the actuarial will pick up additional contributions. But that's being done on an annual basis and being factored in. So the short answer is it really shouldn't, because again, each year that annual contribution is being adjusted based on the progress of how that's going.
Mm-hmm.
And if the assets were not growing fast enough to meet that negative cash flow, then it would require additional contribution. So getting back to page 21, again, looking at the managers, JP Morgan Equity Income is our large cap value manager, up 2.2%, but behind the benchmark of 4.07. Also behind for the fiscal year, 13% versus 18%. As you recall, when we hired that strategy, they were kind of known for their defense. When the market was up, they tended to lag behind, and that's quite frankly what we have seen. Although over the longer period, you hired them back in 2019, 10.5 or 10.25% versus 9.6. So overall, they've done very nicely, but they have underperformed as the market has moved higher quickly here in the last little while. Eaton Vance is our small mid-cap manager, 4% for the quarter versus 5.2, although for the fiscal year, 17.2 versus 16.8%. So again, pretty good for the last 9 months. They've been a very good manager for you over time. There just is some kind of volatility quarter to quarter. They have a really good quarter, a little bit behind this, but again, over time, they have been very, very strong performer for you. As we move to page 22, we get into our international funds. A little bit of a mixed bag. Euro-Pacific Growth was a little bit behind, 2.1 versus 2.6. And WCM was up 3.6 versus that same 2.6 for the benchmark. But if you look on the fiscal year or trailing 1 year basis, you'll see both of these managers outperforming. They've done very well. Just as a reminder, we've got the follow-up discussion related to potentially allocating, taking a piece from each of these managers and potentially adding to a value allocation within the international space. Then as we move down, we've got the short-term bond fund with Baird. Very nice, did positive 7 basis points versus the benchmark of negative 37. And to contrast that with Sawgrass, who's down 1.02, more or less in line with the benchmark, down 98 basis points. Again, their performance has been good, ahead for the fiscal year, but again, slightly behind for the quarter. But again, going back to that Baird discussion, instead of, one of the discussion points was, should we put this into the Sawgrass portfolio to rebalance? And the thought process or the decision was, well, in a rising interest rate environment, we don't want to take as much of that duration risk, so we decided to put it in the Baird short-term fund, and you can certainly see that benefit within the quarter. That certainly has held up nicely. For the period since March, it's up 1.09% versus what would have been a negative performance. So that's very good. And then as you move down, we have PIMCO, our global or diversified bond portfolio, 90 basis points to the positive versus negative 1.4, and for the fiscal year, 8.45 versus 6.38%. So very nice relative performance. And then also an absolute performance, a very nice diversifier, getting a little bit of extra return there as compared to our domestic fixed income. And then the last piece of the portfolio is the JP Morgan Strategic Property Fund. It was down 1.57 for the quarter versus the benchmark of negative 2.8, so a little bit ahead. And for the fiscal year, 9.26 to the negative versus the 10.68. So outperforming, but certainly in a negative fashion. And again, this is a little bit of kind of the delay. We've sort of been talking about this for a while. What we saw in public markets last year, both equity and fixed income sold off, but the real estate was holding up. It did really well. But what we saw in public market real estate is that was already starting to sell down, and we expected this to kind of happen within the real estate sector. The nice thing about it is we're getting a recovery in all those public market securities. Our equities are back up to help kind of offset the negative impact from the real estate portfolio. Let me pause there, see if anybody has any question, comment on anything that I've covered, anything that I've skipped.
I skipped it, haven't we not?
But you know all those things.
How much, what are we earning on that cash, the Goldman Sachs money market?
I haven't seen the absolute latest number, but it was mid-number fours.
It's gonna be somewhere around the overnight lending rate, around 4 or 5%. We'd have to, I could double check it.
But it tends to lag a little bit, like when you see Fed funds. Fed funds moves. It's a couple of months, or a quarter behind, but it has come up quite nicely.
Okay.
Well, you had 1.8 to 2 out, and we made 22.
But it's also a change, you know, when the Fed raised a couple of times last quarter, now that's at an annual rate, and then you're only seeing a 3-month number, but yeah, it's, it should be north of 1% a quarter. That was everything that I wanted to cover within the report, other than to remind you, in the back of the book, we always talk about, we have the fee schedule. So I always wanted to remind you of the fees within the portfolio. So again, the $110 million kind of total asset portfolio, you can see is averaging out about 45 basis points. So just a small sliver of passive management with the Vanguard Fund, roughly $17 million. The rest of the portfolio is actively managed. To do all of that for less than 0.5% is very competitive. But just, again, wanted to make sure we remind you of kind of the fees that you're paying your different managers. And again, just to give you an idea, that estimated fee is at the current rate and assuming the assets don't change at all for 12 months. So they're just annualizing based on the current market value. But within your book, this is being updated every single quarter based on the market values changing up or down.
It's currently 5.1.
5.1.
It's not a bad question. Problem is, when and how you take that one. Good enough.
So now I remember it sent you the book initially, and then we did get that buying book.
Yeah. Well, they all have this right.
Well, so we won't have the slides for you, but if you're ready to discuss kind of the follow-up conversation related to international value, we've got the hard copies in front of you that begins on page 58, I believe, 59. So again, this is going to look very similar to what we've seen the prior few quarters. We had been discussing 3 different funds. On page 60, just to remind you of what those funds were, the DFA International Value, Dodge & Cox International, and Pear Tree Polaris Foreign Value. And the different fee rates, DFA is the cheapest at 30 basis points, Dodge & Cox at 62, and Pear Tree Polaris at 95 basis points. So certainly quite a range in terms of expense for those particular funds. On page 61, really the thing that I would highlight for you is that very top line, the number of holdings. So DFA at 550 positions, very diversified fund, large portfolio in terms of the number, versus Dodge & Cox and Pear Tree at 82 and 63 respectively. So again, those are more concentrated. Now, neither of them are very concentrated, but again, certainly the DFA is more broadly diversified as compared to the other ones. For the comparison, I also included the American funds, your 2 other international strategies, the Euro-Pacific Growth and the WCM Focused, just so you can kind of see in particular how that shakes out in terms of the style chart, because I thought that was very helpful to see those kind of 2 stacked up against the value strategies. So with that, I have that information on page number 63. If you look on the right-hand side, I think it's a little bit clearer, easier to see. So graphically, what we're talking about is that in the columns, you've got value on the left, growth on the right. So the Euro-Pacific and WCM are the yellow and maroon dots, and you can see them clearly on the growth side of that diagram. And so we brought you 3 names to kind of help balance that exposure. DFA is in blue, Dodge & Cox in silver, and Pear Tree Polaris in green. Certainly all of them over on the value side, all of them would do a nice job diversifying the international portfolio from a growth and value perspective. But I think, you know, from last time, I think we were kind of focusing or looking at DFA. 1, it's the lowest fee, and 2, it's kind of most to the left or farther on the value side, which would help balance that growth exposure, in particular with WCM, but even to a lesser degree, Euro-Pacific growth. And then following, we've got a lot of the statistics, returns, begin on page 64. One of the things that we had talked about, and in the shorter run, you know, it's been kind of beneficial, the growth has been outperforming value. So by not making this decision, say, 3 months or 6 months ago, it's actually helped just a little bit to be more in those growth strategies. But certainly, we would expect value to complement the strategies nicely, and again, likely to have a period where value is going to do better than growth here at some point. But again, if you look on page 64, long-term trailing returns, growth has definitely outperformed. Your two strategies with American Funds and WCM have outperformed each of these other strategies. But again, that has been in a period where growth has done better with value. Again, not to be spend too much time, but let me pause there, see if any has questions, comments. I'm happy to go through more of the information, statistics, but we've covered a lot of that in prior meetings, so I don't want to spend too much time if you guys have any thoughts or questions on potentially doing something with the international allocation. And I'll throw out there, in total you have $11 million between your Euro-Pacific growth and the WCM strategies. So if you're looking at half or something close to half, you're talking about $5 or $5.5 million potentially as an allocation to kind of balance out that the current weightings of WCM growth. Just to kind of put some dollars behind what we're talking about.
I'll just add that I follow BlackRock. They're one of the largest asset allocators in the world. And their latest their latest quarterly piece, they did play up international value as opposed to international growth. They're tilting that way, especially international. They put a big article out about how they like that position. It's a tactical thing. They change their minds quarterly, if not faster. You certainly can't keep up with them, but they're echoing what you're saying right now.
Well, and one of the things that we have talked about in different quarters last year when value was doing better than growth, we were underperforming a bit relative because of that kind of growth lean in the portfolio. Certainly benefited us the last 6 months to have that rebound in growth. But just in terms of kind of balancing that out from an ongoing perspective, I think having a little bit more balance, you certainly have the size to add that allocation and not diminish anything with the other strategies.
Question for you. We're about 2 to 1 Euro-Pacific to WCM.
Correct.
Assuming we went with kind of the 50-50 growth value split, how would you recommend divvying up the Euro-Pacific versus WCM?
Yep. So the number that, obviously if you went 50-50, you're talking about $5.5 million. So of that, I would lean toward about 3.5 from Euro-Pacific and 1.5 from WCM. That would get you to 5, or say 3.75 and 1.75.
What page are you?
It's just, so I was on page 16, where I just had the current market values.
And that's what you recommend?
Correct.
What was that again? I asked questions in my.
So if the number was 5 million, and I said 1.5 million from WCM, so that would leave you approximately $2 million in that fund, and then 3.5 million from Euro-Pacific, leaving you, about 4 million, give or take. So again, taking more from the Euro-Pacific, the larger cap fund, and then WCM, that more aggressive growth strategy. Again, kind of trying to maintain that larger piece in Euro-Pacific than the WCM, but not taking equal, because it takes WCM down to almost nothing.
Mr. Chair, are you looking for a motion?
Are we approving the report, or voting on this?
Oh, I guess that's the other stuff you're stopping for the report. This was, I guess, technically another section, so separate from the actual quarterly regular report.
Don't we
Yeah,
approve
have
the
your
report by
approval.
board?
Yeah, for both 1A and 1B, board by board.
Okay, so why don't we start with the general board for a motion for 1A and
So moved.
Second.
Nick Curry,
Yes.
Dan Jansen,
Yes.
Christine Hoffman, Brandon Maresma,
Yes.
Eddie Guerra.
Yes.
And we need to approve 1B. Motion.
But isn't that the possible action?
Why don't
Yeah,
we do
that's,
it?
yeah, that's
Two
the
L
action.
of one
Do
A.
one A all the way around.
Okay. Please.
So moved.
David Cohill,
Yes.
Marvin Dupree,
Yes.
Rudy Dean,
Yes.
John Costello.
Yes.
Firefighter report, motion.
Motion approved.
Ed Dawson,
Yes.
Lance Huish,
Yes.
Debbie White.
Yes.
Okay, so we're voting to.
Potentially allocate or diversify the international holdings with the introduction of a new fund. Again, previous board discussions have been, I feel like leaning towards the DFA fund. Certainly, there are a lot of benefits of that. Again, lower fee, I would argue kind of provides the most diversification because it's farthest on the value side as compared to the other strategies. But again, all three of these are good strategies. But if that's the one that we like, then I would recommend, again, the number that, if it's $5 million, the 3.5 from Euro Pacific, with 1.5 from WCM to fund DFA or one of the other strategies if you preferred one of them.
And the motion would need to be specific like that, to state how much comes from each fund.
If one board would approve, then the others have to follow suit, or,
Or we can't do it.
so let's have a discussion. What you want to do.
Do we need a motion before discussion? I left my Roberts in the house.
Normally you would do discussion after the motion, but before we start going through motions, I would think let's see if we're all on the same page. It would be my thought on that. It's not, it's a little bit of a departure from Robert's.
I would agree. I'm moving it 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think we beat this kind of to death 6 months ago when we decided as a collective board.
To do it, yeah.
Yeah, the diversification was good. It is funny how it all worked out, just waiting that 6 months. It definitely put us in a much better shaving that paper money off the top from the growth fund. But, yeah, I personally agree to what Franklin said earlier.
I agree.
Good with that, or you want something different? Okay, so, you want to make the motion?
I'll make a motion to move $1.5 million from the WCM fund and $3.5 million from the Euro Pacific fund to invest $5 million in the DFA International Fund.
We need a second from the
Second.
board. Second.
Hold on, I'm writing. Hold on.
You need Cohill to repeat it for you?
Nope, I got it. So I have the first from David Cohill, second was who? From Marcus. Here. Okay. John Costello,
Yes.
Rudy Dean,
Yes.
Marvin Dupree,
Yes.
David Cohill.
Yes.
For general, do we want a motion for the same?
So moved.
Second.
Nick Curry,
Yes.
Dan Jansen.
Yes.
Christine Hoffman.
Yes.
Brandon Maresma,
Yes.
Eddie Guerra.
Yes.
Firefighters, motion, or something different?
So moved to accept same motion
Second.
to Cohill.
Ed Dawson,
Yes.
Lance Huish,
Yes.
Debbie White.
Yes.
Yay for 3-4 quorum.
So the only other potential consideration, and I've taken you back to page 17 up on the screen, we still have, we talk about this each quarter, having this overweight to equity. We are within the ranges of our policy, but each time we talk about whether we may want to draw that back. Last time, Eddie had let us know you needed some cash for upcoming benefit payments, so we just used that to help draw back. We didn't actually make any sort of kind of collective decision. But is there any interest in rebalancing some of that overweight that we currently have? Again, it works out in dollars is about $4.5 million over target. combined between the international, which is only 0.3%, and the domestic equity.
You still have a 20% threshold, more or less, between 4% and 5%, say,
So we-
before we hit the.
Correct, we're still inside that range, and more or less for the last year or so, as long as we've been kind of under, we've been happy to stay there. But again, I just wanted to make sure we revisit that topic and make sure we're still comfortable there.
What was our,
Future, future backdrop payouts. and
yeah,
stuff.
what is our future, give us 6 months, maybe?
Before the end of the year, we're looking at maybe 200,000, somewhere around there. So it's not, as far as, compared to this 4.5 million, it's not, that's significant.
We're making money on domestic equity, I think.
Just look at your own bonds.
Or cash.
No, it doesn't have to be, you go to cash. Yeah. Which again, you already have, 1.8 or so sitting in cash, you got a healthy position, but, and again, you're within the ranges of the policy, you're not out of bounds, but this is, each quarter we kind of talk about this because we've been within 1 or 2% each time. Sometimes it's been over, and we've had to move back. But while we're close, again, I just want to make sure you're comfortable in this current position. And again, if we need money for backdrop or other things, we can look to peel back from equity and just continue to draw that back down, just on an as-needed basis as opposed to a.
Well, I said we can leave it there till the next quarter.
I would say to the next quarter.
Okay.
Are there any advantages now to selling high and buying low that you see? Or,
No, you're up 13% for your current fiscal year.
so I'm good with that, that's why.
That's the argument. I mean, you're certainly up. Will 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now be lower than that?
I'm good with leaving it, I just want to make sure that
Yeah.
there's not an opportunity.
Right, we're missing something here.
Give us a dirt.
It's,
Turn the market value.
the flip side is, equities are up, depending on the benchmark, 25, 30% over the last 12 months. You take a few of those, those profits off the table. That's I think the argument for doing it while the market is up. Not that we're predicting the market to go down tomorrow, but, you've had a very nice run, and so taking a few of those profit dollars off the table. And again, even if you put it in only on cash and it's earning 5%, that's not
That's
that
better
bad.
than losing 4%.
That's the argument. Yep. Again, I'm not going to try to tell you what's going to happen next month or the next short period, but again, anytime you can harvest some gains after being up, that much over 6, 9 months, 12 months, usually not a bad thing.
It's an official recommendation.
If we were to shade a little off of our bigger winners on the domestic side,
Right.
what funds and how much?
So if you were to go back to target, that's $4.5 million. You have more in the Vanguard fund than you do in either the Allspring or the JP Morgan fund. So again, and I wrote that down, just assuming or thinking we might do this. I would take 2.5 from Vanguard, 1.5 from JP Morgan, and 500 from Allspring. That would more or less balance all 3 of those strategies with roughly the same number of dollars after the action is done.
And put it where?
Put it in cash. You can also put it in the fixed income portfolio was down, but again,
No.
our collectively, we've been hesitant to do that.
When's the next Fed funds meeting?
September. They're off in August. Yeah, and that kind of follows, or the other option is we could put it in the Baird shorter term fund. So it's in fixed income, but not taking that same duration risk.
But if we're just still sitting with Goldman Sachs, still making, 5, 4, 5, somewhere in there, and I don't see that rate going down.
Well, not drastically.
Yeah.
I mean, it would likely require the Fed to start dropping rates. And they're still, if anything, moving slightly higher.
And that 4.5 wouldn't put us overweight in cash.
No, I mean, we don't have
Is there even a category for that?
So
yeah,
cash
usually the
is
max is
10%.
10% by the policy.
Okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
just
okay.
make sure, so we'd be taking about 5 from equity.
Be 4.5. Or again, we could also take a half step, have each of those amounts and move, say 2.25.
Actually, I like that idea better. That's what's,
As an outsider, I like the idea of taking some profits going. in.
Yeah, I mean, we made-
Actually, you're bringing it closer to the target.
We made 3.1 million in the Vanguard, is what that appreciated, so essentially we just be taking our profits, most of those, which.
Who remembers the last time that the US debt was downgraded and the market sold off 25% in the September, in the September of 2011, and the whole fiscal year gains and all?
You think we're at significant risk of default?
No, I think you're, no, we were downgraded by Moody's the other day, I'm sorry, it was, I'm sorry, Fitch the other day. This is the idea of being a little conservative, I look for the plan at 13% and capturing some profit.
But we were downgraded because of the risk of defaulting in the future.
Yeah, I don't want to, I'm just pointing out that there's some drama that can ensue to make stocks get spooked and sell off.
If we were up 13% from zero, I'd agree, but we're up 13 from being down 18. We're not even back to, the height of the market 2 years ago, a year and a half ago.
Yeah, with this long-term plan that unfortunately, it's been around here longer than all of us, but it's will be here for a lot longer as well, but they do measure these end of the year fiscal checkpoints, the actual evaluation, the experience study, and the actual evaluation report. So it is nice to have positive gains on the books when actually, at the end of the fiscal year. So I understand your point from point A and B, but it's nice when you cross over fiscal year in good, comfortable shape in excess of issue waiver.
The other thing I'd point out too is we're not talking about selling out of equity because we think they're going down. It's just going back closer to target. Either halfway to target or to target, you'd still be at 60% equity. It's not, you'd still have that kind of full exposure. We just have a little bit extra exposure today.
And Justin, you were saying our plan views cash as fixed income, so you can do that, there's no problem.
We have a line item in the policy, and you actually, not to distract you, but within the book, we have an update to the policy to talk about.
Okay.
But if it's helpful to go to page, it's 2, you actually have 2 investment policies, but if you go to page 2 within your book, it's probably page 4 or 5 of paper, you'll actually see a table, and you can see that cash and equivalents, it's targeted at 0, but we have a 0 to 10 range. And again, if we're also concerned about the level of cash, whatever we took out of equity, we could also split. Put part of that in cash, part in the Baird bond fund or something, to kind of moderate that just a little bit.
I looked up that Baird fund. It's telling me the yield on that is about 4.99. So it might take a little while to update to 5.25. But it's got a SEC yield of 5, but it's got a duration risk of 1.8.
Yeah, it's a 1 to 3 year, so it takes a little, it's not a money market fund, but it's taking a little bit more duration certainly than cash, but significantly less than Sawgrass.
smells like a high yield thing.
It is with risk.
Right.
So why are we taking risk and not getting anything for it?
I think that's what you're seeing is again, that fluctuation in the yield curve, as rates have really shot up on the short end and then the 2 and 3 are lower, you're kind of seeing some of that lower yield slightly out of the yield curve.
Yeah.
the argument is if rates stabilize or maybe even go back lower again, not Fed funds, because that's not going to happen likely, at least for the next 6 or 12 months, but any of the longer rates potentially
It would
stabilize.
allow them to stretch out a little bit.
But from that standpoint, again, that's why I initially said cash. With this, just go ahead and move to cash. You're yielding the same, if not slightly higher than even the bear fund. And again, still within the allowable range of the policy, but if we weren't comfortable holding that much cash, because again, for the last 15 years, cash didn't do much for us, so we always wanted to have it invested somewhere. This is really the first time we're doing something on that cash.
And that's your recommendation? Take the excess from domestic equity?
Domestic equity, yep.
And just park it in cash?
I wouldn't do the whole amount. I wouldn't be right at, I like the idea of going halfway myself. Because I agree with John that
Take a look.
we're still chugging.
It's just we're not over.
What was the total percent?
So 4.1%, which equates to $4.5 million.
Right.
If you have that amount, instead of 1.5 out of JP Morgan, you're talking about 750, 250 from Allspring, and 1.25 from the Vanguard Fund.
750 from JP, what was the next one?
250 from Allspring,
Okay.
and 1.25 from the Vanguard. If we do this, obviously we'll revisit it next quarter and see where we are, see what the Fed has done with current rates, and see.
Approve that.
Well, I'd like to make a motion to move from domestic equity, 750 from JP Morgan, 250 from Allspring, 1.25 from Vanguard into cash.
Second.
Do we need to say the Goldman Sachs, or is that where all of our cash is?
That's what it's our last week.
Nick Curry,
Yes.
Dan Jansen.
Yes.
Christine Hoffman.
Yes.
Brandon Resma.
Yes.
Eddie Guevara.
Yes.
One of the other boards want to make a motion to follow suit?
So moved.
Second.
Ed Dawson,
Yes.
Lance Huish,
Yes.
Debbie White,
Yes.
Police board motion?
So moved.
Thanks.
David Cohill,
Yes.
Marvin Dupree,
Yes.
Rudy Dean,
Yes.
John Costello.
Yes. I'd like to revisit this next quarter meeting just to see how we're doing.
Absolutely.
What it looks like if you can include that.
Of course.
Right?
So the last item we have for you is the investment policy statement. I just kind of alluded to it a second ago. It's in the actual meeting packet. So before I get into it, on page number 2 of the draft policy, there is a little bit of a typo that I want to mention to you. Within it shows the total fixed income at 10% as the target. It should be 35%. Does everyone see that on page 2? So just want to make sure that is corrected. As for the rest of the IPS, the reason we're bringing this to your attention is House Bill 3 did pass. This is something that has been discussed for quite a while. It's known as sort of the anti-ESG bill, even though ESG specifically is not referenced in the bill. But really the short version is the law is requiring us to do what we've always done, and that's to focus solely on risk and return with the investments within the portfolio. But because this is now law, it's going to be in the statutes, we're going to have to follow. We're going to have some reporting requirements associated with this new law. Although we're still waiting on maybe some rules and the report itself. Since the law became effective on July 1st, we wanted to go ahead and bring bring an update to the policy that incorporates some of the provisions of the law to have this in the document. This was sent to Pedro in advance of this discussion, but I think it's fairly kind of boilerplate language. Again, a lot of it just taken straight from the statute. So with that, I will mention one other change that's not specifically related to House Bill 3 is on page number 3 of the policy. You see it's highlighted in yellow. In your old IPS, you specifically mentioned what the actuarial assumed rate of return was. And so if you then, in the subsequent meeting, changed your assumed rate, your IPS would kind of be in conflict. So I just changed the language to reference the most recently approved assumed rate, so that way it wouldn't be out of compliance or out of date should you change that number. Then if you move to page number 5, right at the bottom, within the limitations section is the first real addition related to the House Bill 3 language. And again, this is a reference to the managers and what they can do, and essentially they have to focus on pecuniary factors. They're not allowed to factor in, social or I'm drawing a blank on the environmental, social, or other factors. And then also it relates to their proxy voting. So as managers are voting proxies, they can't be taking other factors into consideration in terms of how they're voting. They have to do it based on pecuniary factors or risk of return. Then if you skip ahead to pages 8 and 9, you get the remainder of the additions. So within the communication section, item H at the top of page 8, we are going to have a reporting requirement that's due on December 15th of each odd numbered year. So this will be the first year, and then in 25 and so on, we'll have to do a report. We don't know what that report's going to look like yet. Dan, I don't know if you want to jump in and let them know kind of your conversations, but we're acknowledging that it is going to be a requirement. We just don't know yet what it's going to look like.
So we're working with the state of Florida on that right now. So House Bill 3 passed, and so it's a 60-page document. It sits on the Department of Management Services desk, and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. So we've been in communication with them trying to figure out what this biennial report's going to look like, because they don't know. And I've heard from the extreme it's going to be, requirements of listing all the transactions, every transaction portfolio, every proxy vote portfolio. How does the board, stance on each action item, which would just be untenable, administrative resource drain. So we're trying to get it to a yes/no question and an affirmation date. So it's, does the board agree that all decisions were made consistent with pecuniary factors only as the sole decision-making criteria? And I talked to Keith Brinkman last week. He said, Dan, I know how you feel. It's in our legal review right now, and I think you're going to be pleased, but I haven't heard back from him. So the language of the policy has been reviewed and approved with all the attorneys in the state and Department of Management Services, and reviewed with them, and then the biennial reports, we're working on a draft of that right now. And looking at that, we have to file it by December 15th, so there has to be a decision. They're not workshopping this, so they will just be telling us what's happening. It's pretty interesting, once they get into the politics involved.
We're getting back to page 9, the other two additions within the compliance section. Essentially section or item G just says that we will not be recommending strategies we will only be recommending strategies based on pecuniary factors. And then if there was an RFP for any type of services for the plan, again, you would be focusing on only pecuniary factors and not any of the social, political, or ideological items. So again, this is essentially just generic language related to the law, getting in compliance. There's certainly a chance that we will have to come back and update the policy again, potentially, depending on some of the rules or anything else. But again, at this point, we just wanted to make sure we had that kind of the basics covered, get this into the IPS so we're in compliance with the law. And also it gives us something to hand to the investment managers to make sure they're following what they need to be doing. Any questions? If there are no questions, and you agree that it would need to be approved by motion. All
boards, need a motion?
Police board, motion to approve the changes to the investment policy.
Rudy Dean,
Yes.
John Costello,
Yes.
Marvin Dupree,
Yes.
David Cohill,
Yes.
Okay, general board
So
motion?
moved.
Second.
Nick Curry,
Yes.
Dan Jansen,
Yes.
Christine Hoffman,
Yes.
Brandon Maresma,
Yes.
Eddie Guevara,
Yes.
Firefighter board motion?
Motion to approve.
Motion to approve.
Second.
Ed Dawson,
Yes.
Lance Huish,
Yes.
Debbie White.
Yes.
Okay, moving on, Dustin's report.
Right. So we've got a lot of other things to talk about. So I'm just kind of blow through that plan membership there, not really any significant changes there. You know, our non-vested employees went up as it does this time of year as we hire lifeguards and things like that. So nothing out of the ordinary there. The summary plan descriptions update where it says, updated summary plan description has been published on the city's internal and external website. That is a lie. Pedro told me that they were gonna have that to me on Friday, so I, went ahead and included that statement in this. And, they're not up there yet, but they should be up there very soon. So, be looking for that. I'll probably send out an email with links to those and those are published. They are, the holdup is they are combining the general plans. We had 2 summary plan descriptions for the general plan, one for people hired before the November update, one for people hired after November 2013. And they're combining that into one summary plan description, so it just took a little longer than they expected. Continuing education, we've got the FPPTA conference coming up October 1st to the 4th, and that is here at Sawgrass. So if you are interested in going through that, that's probably the easiest one to attend that there will be, and the least expensive for the plan. So, sure.
Continuing your education.
There was also going to be the state just sent out an email, I believe either yesterday or today, about the police and fire plan conference. To those dates, but it is going to be in Orlando this year, so if you're interested in that, I can pass along that information as well.
Is this the free one, the state for?
That is the free one.
It's the February the state puts on, I think it's the 25th and 26th and 27th of September, excuse me. Yeah, so I mean, it's worth bringing up now because it'll be in between the 2 meetings.
Right. So, if anybody's interested, I'll pass along the information no matter what. I'll just forward the email that I got from them to you guys, but let me know soon because those rooms will book up fast, I'm sure. Software update. Last I talked to GRS, they told me that they, we were going to be in beta by the end of July. That did not happen. I was talking on the phone with them yesterday. They said they have escalated this and have allocated more resources to it, and they were not happy that it has taken them this long. They've got all the data in there. They weren't happy with the output of how it looked to the employee once the employee ran numbers and things. And because of the way our backdrop scenarios came, that they just didn't like. They thought it looked too confusing. So they're kind of reassessing their what the output looks like to the employee to make sure that it's readable. So that's where we're at. They said by the end of this month now should have some beta testers and running. At the end of the last meeting, we didn't have a quorum for the fire board, and then we had the special meeting. I was asked to investigate, look into the feasibility of financially splitting apart the plans so that they could make possibly make individual decisions. Whereas right now, any financial decision has to be made by all 3 boards because our funds are all pooled. So, it was was asked to look into what would that look like, what would the process be, and what are all the ramifications of the possibility of that. So I've got some statements I'm going to go through here from various entities, attorneys, ANCO, auditors, finance, what it would look like for me, and city clerk. So, pension attorney, I'll just read through some of this. It was requested, there is no requirement that 3 boards have the same investments or investment policy that is currently in our ordinance, is what the attorney is saying there. The 3 boards could continue to meet together at the same time and place, but can vote on investment issues individually. The decision on the source of needed cash should be made by the board of trustees between meetings. So this is kind of in response to one of the questions that was asked about who needs to be making decisions on where our funds are coming from. This is kind of last time we had that issue of does finance department kind of have the authority to pull money as they need it from what areas and things. So they're just kind of giving some guidance on that as well. And then the consultant should be asked about any added cost for separating the investments of the 3 retirement systems. So, Brandon, not to put you on the spot, but if you don't mind, could you weigh in on what are the potential costs as far as money managers with people the ones that we currently have that you spoke to? What does it look like for future potential investments and potential opportunity costs?
Sure. So it's kind of a multifaceted answer. So if you were to kind of split into 3 plans, but maintain the current manager lineup and maintain your relationship with your custodian, there would really be no impact. I spoke with each of your separate account managers, and they would continue to view you, as a single group or collectively, even though each sub-account would be smaller for fee purposes and the like. They would view that the same.
But even if we don't, one plan doesn't meet a minimum or something of that nature?
Correct. They will view it as one relationship, which essentially the accounts after splitting would be the same as they were before. Again, just obviously sub amounts, but they would view that the same. So really, from that standpoint, no impact. Where the impact starts to happen is if one board begins to make a different decision, and you're taking, call it a third of the assets and going in a different direction. So not only is their third potentially impacted because they're trying to invest in a new strategy and they don't have the collective weight of the other 2 boards, and then the other 2 boards have, again, the overall asset picture has been diminished, so that you're potentially looking at kind of cost increases, as those assets, you tier down in some of those different fund levels. So that's where it could change. But strictly the splitting of the plans would not have that impact. But to the extent that the decisions start to be separate, that's where it certainly could have an impact. It's difficult to quantify because it depends on what decisions you're making. If you're replacing one manager with another that might be cheaper or more expensive, there's certainly factors that go into it. But certainly that's where it potentially gets to be a bit more costly.
Well, that's my concern, because the fire department obviously is closed, and we have the least amount of money. So it'll really hit us the worst as far as strength in numbers. We're not gonna have that anymore.
To the extent that you go differently than the group, yes. You'd probably be subject to more of those increases.
That's my concern.
Correct. Now, Justin kind of already mentioned the other service providers. There's certainly an element there, just strictly from our perspective, and I don't mean to jump ahead if you don't need to do that, but sort of the average fee, we charge a single fee for the collective 3 boards, which works out to be about $14,350 on an annual basis. If you were to be split individually, and we kind of took it as like a sort of a worst case scenario in that not only are you separate, but you're meeting separately and then making different decisions, Obviously, there's a lot more involved there, it becomes more administration, more time. So we put in 18,000 annually for each board in that sort of scenario. But again, that's splitting and doing everything differently. If you're just technically split but still meeting like we are today, then that is certainly going that far is not necessary.
Without pinpointing an exact concern, I would say that my initial concern is that there's an unintended consequence that we're not recognizing at this point. I like the board as a whole. I think we're stronger as a whole.
Who thought of this idea in the first place of splitting it?
Attendance of a certain board. So, like at the last meeting, we weren't able to, like Brendan didn't get to make a presentation that he had prepared and stuff because we didn't have a full quorum from all three boards, so we can't make any financial decisions if we don't have a quorum from all three boards because our funds are jointly held.
Historically, I know it was our fire board that didn't have the quorum, but historically, there's been times police didn't have a quorum, the general didn't have a quorum. That's very rare.
This is true. Recently, it has been the fire board, but we're talking with Ed. One of the problems was that Jacksonville was telling them last minute that they couldn't come to the meeting, the employees. And after like every meeting, I send a letter to the city of Jacksonville and to their union reps requesting that they have time off to come to these meetings. And last minute, Jacksonville would say, no, we're short on people, you can't leave. Well, now we've gone through the union and Ed has got approval through the union, through the city. Now they can't do that anymore. Once it's approved, they have to allow them to come to the meetings. And so we've kind of secured some additional, concrete that they'll be able to come to these meetings more regularly in the future. And of course, Debbie's committed, even though you live on the beach,
Yeah.
you're going to be here. And I think we've secured up some of that issue. I'll continue going through what we do have here, though. This is still what the pension attorney has said. The city code provisions concerning the investments of each retirement system's asset empower each system board of trustees to invest in assets of each pension plan and engage in investment. So basically what he's saying is in our city ordinance, all three plans are separate already. There's nothing that needs to go to council for this to happen because there's nowhere in the ordinance that it even references that our money are pooled. So the question then becomes, well, if we were going to go down this path, what would that look like? Attorneys are circling the wagons on that right now, and I don't have a clear answer as to what do all three boards need to vote. Does one board need to vote? Is it an administrative task that just needs to get done? I don't know. We're waiting to hear. We kind of already went over ANCO's response there. And
I'm sorry, Dustin. Read that second paragraph under the area you were just talking about. It says that with the fireman's fund being closed, are you saying we could have a recommendation that they take a different direction in the longer term? Because
in the longer term, 20 years out is what the numbers I was referring to. Yeah, that's what the actuary. I was talking to Brad Armstrong yesterday. He said, somewhere he would expect, somewhere between 20 and 30 years down the road, maybe the fire plan wants to take a different investment path than the other plans, being they're closed and the aging of their people. So that's still a good portion of it.
okay, thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. From finances side, this is probably would have the most impact on finance than any other individual group, just because of how everything is reconciled. And I'll just kind of read through a statement that we got from the finance department. Monthly investment reconciliations. Currently, there are 4 investment accounts. If separated, there would then be 12. I think those are, domestic equity, international equity, fixed income, and real estate accounts that they're, that's the four, and then, so those are triple. And, annual internal audit testing, we do extensive internal audit testing of the pension plans, which has mitigated the time and cost of our external auditors. The time spent on investment note disclosures and testing would increase with the number of investment accounts, again, 4 to 12. That's also, I spoke with the auditors, I should have mentioned that earlier, and there would be, they said between 25 to 30 hours of an increase in how much time they would need to dedicate to the audit if we were to split out financially. And the other statement that they had is that if we did this, they would request that we did it on October 1st, you know, beginning of a fiscal year, so we're not trying to make that transition in the middle of a fiscal year. Reconciliation of the annual audited investment statements. As part of the year-end audit process, we receive final audited investment statements, must be used in our financial statements. This is essentially a 13th reconciliation, again, 4 to 12. So it's just, you know, finance listing out the number of things that it would increase for them kind of exponentially there. For meetings, if the meeting date and times would be separated, finance staff would have to attend more meetings and monitor additional agendas and minutes for related decisions. In summary, the cost and complexity of accounting for separate portfolios would increase given our staffing levels. I'm also concerned that this change has potential to delay the delivery of the annual financial reports. One of the city's long-held financial goals is to provide the most cost-effective and efficient solutions of pension administration to ensure financial stability over the long term. The decision needs to be made if the benefits of making this change outweighs the costs. So it's mutually beneficial to keep costs as low as possible for the city and the pension plans. So we don't want pension plans paying unnecessary costs, and we don't want the city having to dedicate more time, thus having to charge the pension plans additional. But if it's worth the benefit, then that's a, you know, for you guys to decide. For me as a pension administrator, the real time vampire would be if we had different meeting times and had to do 3 separate meetings. Other than that, it wouldn't be that much. But talking with Brennan and some others, when they've seen this happen before, it's not long before they're having 3 separate meetings. Once they go from joint 2 separate boards, and they have, even if they have joint meeting times, it's not long before one board wants to do their own thing. I don't know where to take it from there. I think that's kind of all my, anybody got any discussion items or anything they want to add from there?
I don't see any benefit.
I don't see any benefit other than more costs. Potential.
Yeah, as long as we have future attendance, I see the benefit if we're consistently, we have one board not attending, and not just saying that's it, because that was just recently, you know, if every meeting it's one board that's not attending, then I could see a benefit to that. But as long as we can keep good attendance, it does seem to be a lot of
Well, for the time that I've done the board, it's only happened once that I'm aware of, and that was the last meeting. Nothing out here.
yeah, there's like 2 out of the last 3 meetings. That was really good. But still, that was rare. That doesn't usually happen.
John and I are on 2 different shifts, so there's really only one day that it could land on that we would both be on at the same time. So there's, but it's been straightened out with, supposedly with the chief.
And Dustin always made sure he had a quorum. He didn't call me. He thought Ed was gonna be there. He had the wrong number.
Yeah.
Something happened. We don't know what happened. Something happened. So he thought Ed would be there, otherwise he could have called me and I would come, I would have drove up, no problem.
Yeah.
I think that collective thoughts and discussion from the boards is really helpful to the other boards. And if the issue is attendance, it sounds like we've taken some steps. I think it's good to do this homework, to know, but for me, I do not see how just the added cost and hassle and everything like that would be beneficial if, because we haven't really differed on any, I mean,
We're not
everything
fighting over
we've
it.
discussed, we've kind of come to the same result, maybe more or less aggressive than we wanted to be, but I think at the end, we've been on the same page.
Well, I'll be honest with you, that's the reason they asked me to sit on this board, because of attendance, and that was how many years ago? So this is nothing new.
How old is the plan?
It's better than it used to be. I know when you see it, like, oh God, twice in a row, and it was typically the,
Well, and then going to 4 to 12 audits per board, that's like, I think it's costing time and staffing.
I just think the conversation needs to be started. We have 3 different boards, 3 different life cycles. With the fire board is closed, obviously their investment outlook is going to change significantly as that plan ages. Their attendance has been an issue. I'm appreciative that Ed and John got the union to step in to kind of ensure their attendance. I posed the question because I could not, in good conscience, perform the fiduciary duty to my members when 2 out of the 4 times we meet, we weren't able to do anything. And that was, again, to Mayor Hoffman, I think it is something, the exercise, the homework, to be able to look into, because I think it is a question that needs to be raised. I'm hoping the attendance doesn't become an issue, but I think that it's a question that is going to come up more frequently as the fire plan ages out and a majority of their members move from the active to the retirement side. Because clearly, they're just going to be needing a different investment strategy than the general police need for their members.
Well, I'll throw a little monkey wrench in the room too. There's talk and conversation of PFPF on the other side of the ditch being reactivated for our new employees as well. So, I don't know how much ground they have, to do that, but there's conversation.
We bring back the defined benefit plan, City of Jacksonville.
Well, at the next meeting, I'll bring back any further information I received from the attorneys, like the answer to the question on the process and anything else we learned. And so it is good information to know. It's been kind of enlightening to look into. Employee elections, we do have police and fire board employee elections coming up over the next couple of months here. The city clerk's office is going to be running that. They're going to be doing them all electronically this time. So those will get sent out to the employees' emails. It'll be in kind of a survey format, from what I understand. We've talked with the attorneys, and there's no problem in doing it this way. It's just the city has always done, their paper ballots and stuff. But we kind of test rolled it last time with fire. We're just sending it out through emails to their City of Jax emails, so it's easier to do with a smaller plan like that. And so I think that's what they're going to be doing this over the next couple of months, is starting that whole process, sending out electronically. It was requested that possibly move future meetings from the second Tuesday of the month to maybe the 4th Tuesday, not specifically that, but to be later in the month so that we would have a flash report for the month proceeding. So we would have our quarterly numbers and a flash report for the month preceding that as well. So is there anyone that would have an issue with that? Because at the next meeting, I'm going to be scheduling the next calendar year's worth of meetings. So somebody got a problem with, 4th Tuesday of I'll look at that, yeah, it is on Tuesday, but that is a big, like, vacation week. A lot of people take off that week because they've already got 2 holidays, days on that, so,
Nice.
we'll look at- we'll look at that. Other than that, is there?
Well, you can look at it Wednesday, rather than
Yeah. Well,
another day.
not
Wednesday,
yeah,
another
maybe,
day.
maybe the week before, the 3rd or something, I don't know. I think Brennan usually has a conflict on the 3rd or Tuesday of, those months. Correct.
Can we go back to the feasibility of the split? Sitting here ruminating on things, and I think we can all agree fire is maybe a different tact at some point in the distant future, but it surprised me that there wasn't anything that said we did need to meet, or did need to have, combined, pension boards.
Sorry.
Should we be codifying something? I'm just thinking out loud, and I would defer to Pedro on this. Should we codify something that says we do meet jointly and we do manage the fund jointly? So that if and when we do change something, it is an active action by the city council to say, instead of one board, 3 members of one board being able to make that decision, is it something that either should be done by all 3 boards have to approve it, or the city council has to approve it? Again, I'm just thinking out loud, it seems like that would be a pretty big move compared to the practice of how we've run it for all this time. So maybe there should be some more intention involved in that versus.
That's part of what they're looking into right now, like reviewing chapter 185 and 175 to make sure that there's not any issues with even saying something like that, because that may not even be possible to codify something. I don't know. So that is part of what they're looking at right
Good to
now.
know. I mean, I think this is all good information to have in front of us, so.
Dustin, just not creating a spin around this, but does it make, or did it, I know it here, maybe it occurred, does it make sense for the fire plan to be a tail on top of the city Jacksonville plan and work through the processes with them, or to stay with us?
I think that is actually codified in
It
the,
was.
There's a
Decision we
contract
made.
that we had with the city when we merged.
Well, I asked that question when they decided to do the split.
Yeah, okay.
It's
That
all
was about the same
very
thing.
simple and easy to understand.
Okay, I think that's all from me.
I realized I forgot one little thing, since you're just talking about chapter 185. The state did just announce the state monies for in this case, the police plan. There was $278,000 this year, which is a slight increase over last year.
And I don't know what happens with your money. Did you ever find out?
I've been told again that it's coming back to you guys.
Well, I can send you another report that shows it's not.
Please, because he actually showed a report where it shows it goes back to you guys again.
It absolutely does not. But this year it's like 450-some thousand. So it's a huge increase because
They got
of
450, you only got 200.
because of something to do with the property tax rates and the way that.
No, not the property taxes, it's the insurance rate. Insurance drastically skyrocketed last year.
That's
So as a
true.
result of the increased insurance across the state, the firefighter pool of money was increased. I thought I saw that Jacksonville Beach Fire got 0.
We
From-
got 0
on the
because it's.
list published by the state.
Yes, because it's reallocated. The whole amount shows it reallocated to City of Jacksonville.
I don't see
So
that.
when you see the report, if you look at the City of Jacksonville, it shows reallocation of a positive amount. If you take Neptune Beach, Atlantic Beach, and Jacksonville Beach, and you add our numbers up of what we show as a negative reallocation, you'll come to the number that Jacksonville is getting for a positive
Yeah.
reallocation.
So as far as the check disbursements from the distribution of premium state taxes is 0.
It is 0 to us because it's reallocated.
Still gotta get something, because there's something wrong, and I don't mean to hold up the rest of the words of this. Let me figure it out.
All right, if there's not further discussion on the administrator's report, then we need a trustee to motion in a second on one of the boards. to
Who's
accept.
good? Oh, that's us.
Make a motion.
No, to accept?
to accept this report?
We don't have to.
No, we don't do permission.
Yep.
I thought you were looking for a motion to adjourn, I was ready.
All right. If there's not further discussion, then a motion to adjourn. and a
So moved.
second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
One point, maybe my calendar